May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. I'm in a different location today. Our sanctuary is still filled with Vacation Bible School. And so I chose to be in front of this stained glass window here at Sonora First United Methodist. The story depicted is the Good Samaritan. And this week's lessons, coming from Romans and from Matthew, will examine both of these characters. We'll examine the one who's injured, who is suffering. For Paul says that in the midst of suffering we find endurance, and endurance produces character, and character finds hope. And how does that work in the midst of a world that suffers? For sometimes we, like the man here, find ourselves beaten down on the road of life, needing someone to give us aid. And then there's the Good Samaritan, the man who cannot walk by, who's moved with compassion, just as in Matthew, Jesus is moved with compassion for those who are like lost sheep. And he says, the harvest is great, the workers are few. And then he sends the disciples out to be good Samaritans, to go into a broken and hurting world and proclaim the good news of God's love and God's grace and God's redemption offered in Jesus Christ. I can still remember the news story. I think it was in the 90s. It took place in Chicago. This woman was being attacked on a bridge. And it was a fairly popular place to walk. And reports came back that even though there were lots of people on that bridge, no one stopped to give aid. No one stopped to help her as she was being attacked. Why is compassion so hard to find? And where can we find it today? What drives this compassion? I think about the story of Mother Teresa. She was asked by a visitor, where does your compassion come from as you go and help those on the streets of Calcutta, the lepers, the poor, the desperately needy? And she says, if it was up to me, I would actually walk by them. But every time I look, I see Jesus reaching up, asking for help. And I cannot pass him by. The Greek word for compassion used in Matthew literally means a gut-wrenching. Have you ever had a gut-wrenching experience where you have seen someone in pain, where you've seen someone suffering, and you have a physical reaction, so much so that you actually find yourself suffering with them and unable to pass them by? For that is what the English word compassion means, to suffer with. To suffer with. I remember I was sitting in a parking lot listening to the radio, and there was a news article about a Harvard study. And what they studied was people and why they reacted in certain ways while they were watching sporting events. You may have seen this, where they're watching a football game and there's a tackle, and suddenly somebody in the group will physically go, "Oh!" as if they too were hit. That's not surprising, according to the research, for Harvard found that if a person had participated in a sport and had experienced the same type of trauma, injury, or exertion that was being seen on the TV, their body would not know the difference between that they were seeing and that which they had experienced, and would dump the same chemical response as if they were actually participating physically in the event. The reaction to that brutal tackle where you have the people go, "Oh!" Their body thinks that it's actually happening, and it has the same chemical response. And so, sometimes when we see someone in pain, we see someone suffering, we literally have a gut-wrenching response. We literally enter into that experience once again because we've been there. Paul says that suffering produces character. It shapes who we are. Being a Christian does not mean that you are exempt from the suffering of life. It means that you do not have to suffer alone, and that even in the midst of the darkness and in the suffering, there is hope, and there is love, and there is faith. Paul says that in the midst of our suffering, if we have faith in God, if we find our hope in the promises of God, no matter how far they seem away, we are given the strength to endure, to hope against hope, because of faith. And having hope in the midst of those dark times, enduring those dark times, hoping in that which is greater than ourselves, hoping in God and God's promise, creates character. Because we know that we are not alone in our suffering, that God is with us, that God is giving us God's strength, that no matter what we've lost and what we are going through, God goes through it with us. God has compassion for us. God suffers with us. We are not alone. And in the end, that hope is confirmed. And we come out on the other side stronger in our faith of a God who walks with us, stronger in the hopes of the promises of God, knowing that they will come to pass in God's time, and stronger in love, because we were loved in the midst of that. And so that character then sees others who are alone, who are hurting, who are lost. And we can relate to them. We may not know what they are specifically going through, but we know what it's like. We know what it's like to feel alone or abandoned when all hope seems gone. And we know what it means to receive that assurance of the presence of God, even in the midst of the pain and the suffering. That is the character of a Christian. There are those who are shaped by faith in other things, who don't know what it means to have God, like the Good Samaritan, come and take care of us in the midst of our suffering. They feel like they are abandoned. They feel like they are alone. Even when God surrounds them by grace, they still do not see it and do not receive it, and therefore are shaped and formed by the idea that they had to go alone. And so when they are walking along and they see someone in a similar situation, they say, I made it, you can make it too. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. All you need to do is put some more effort into it. If I survived it, you can too. And therefore, instead of having compassion, it turns into apathy. If I had to do it alone, you have to do it alone. If I had to rely on myself, you have to rely on myself. If I had to suffer, you have to suffer. And like the Pharisees and like the priests, they walk by that Good Samaritan. They let the sheep wander and be lost. They reject the good news offered in Jesus Christ. All because they felt that they had been abandoned. But God is with us. And the more we hold on to hope, the more we hold on to faith, the more we will find love. And the more compassionate we'll be. For we live in a world where the harvest is great for those who feel abandoned. And they simply want to know that they too are not alone, that God is with them, and that there is still a reason to hope. Amen.